Morning and welcome to the 8th meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take items 5, 6, 7 and 8 in private. Are members agreed? Yes. Members have indicated their agreement. The second item on today's agenda is to consider the Scottish Statutory Instrument which provides for the 2013-14 Spring Budget Revision. Before we come to the motion seeking our approval at agenda item 3, we will have an evidence session on the order. I therefore like to welcome to the committee John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, who is accompanied by two Scottish Government officials this morning, Mr Gordon Wales, Deputy Director of Finance Programme Management Division, and Mr Terry Holmes, Principal Accountancy Advisor, Corporate Reporting Division. And I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. The Spring Budget Revision provides the final opportunity to formally amend the Scottish Budget for 2013-14. It deals with 4 different types of amendments to the budget. Firstly, funding changes that impact on the spending power of portfolios and programmes. Secondly, a number of technical adjustments that have no impact on spending power. Thirdly, a small number of Whitehall transfers. And finally, some budget-neutral transfers of resources between portfolio budgets. The net impact of all of these changes is an increase in the approved budget of £5.5 million from £33,698.9 million to £34,704.4 million. Table 1.2 on page 7 of the supporting document shows the approved budget following the autumn budget revision and the changes sought in the spring budget revision. In relation to funding changes, the spring budget revision reflects a net reduction in funding of £28.1 million. The supporting document to the spring budget revision and the brief guide prepared by my officials provides detailed background on the net funding reduction. In summary, the main adjustments are a funding reduction of £27.4 million for the receipt of historic reserves of police authorities accumulated prior to the creation of the Scottish Police Authority. The sum involved reflects the arrangement agreed by the joint COSLA Scottish Government Settlement and Distribution Group, and as I confirmed to Parliament in May 2013, the sum accruing to the Scottish Government has been used to address the £54.8 million reduction to our fiscal resource DEL budget arising from the March 2013 UK budget. A second factor of £3.3 million reduction to the budget for the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. This reflects the outcome of a rebate for rates paid for the 4 years from 2010-11 to 2013-14. Thirdly, deployment of £3.1 million of available CDEL to the Health and Wellbeing portfolio to support capital investment. The second set of changes comprise a number of technical adjustments to the budget. The technical adjustments are non-cash and budget neutral and have a net positive effect of £24.7 million. It is necessary to reflect these adjustments to ensure the budget is consistent with HM Treasury budgeting and accounting guidance and with the final outturn reported in our annual accounts. With regard to Whitehall transfers and allocations from Her Majesty's Treasury, there is a net positive impact on the budget of £8.9 million. And the final part of the budget revision concerns the transfer of funds within and between portfolios to better align the budgets with profiled spend. There are a number of internal transfers as part of the revision process. These have no impact on overall spending power, and the main transfers between portfolios have been set out in the guide. As in previous years, there are also a number of internal portfolio transfers which have no effect on portfolio totals, but ensure that internal budgets are monitored effectively. The committee will wish to note that as part of our robust budget management process and in line with good practice, we have taken the opportunity at the spring budget revision to deploy emerging underspends to ensure that we maximise public expenditure in 2013-14, in particular to support capital expenditure where possible. The spring budget revision records the deployment of £48.3 million of redirected budget, representing less than 0.2% of the fiscal DEL budget. Details are given at Annex C of the brief guide prepared by my officials. The spring budget revision also reflects the proposed transfer of budget from resource to capital in respect of the Scottish budget, noting that the Scottish budget records capital that scores in the Scottish Government's consolidated accounts or the accounts of directly funded bodies. In the context of our Her Majesty's Treasury budget, the planned resource to capital transfer is £220 million. This switching is managed within the total DEL available to the Scottish Government. This is a slight reduction compared to the estimated £243 million transfer set out in the 2013-14 draft budget, and takes account of the latest profile of the Government's overall capital programme. It is my intention to write to the Finance Committee once we have provisional outturn figures in June, with a table setting out the actual resource to capital transfers by portfolio and programme in a single format, to the table provided in my letter of July last year in respect of financial year 2012-13. As we approach the financial year end, we will continue in line with our normal practice to monitor forecast outturn against budget, and wherever possible, we will seek to utilise emerging underspends to ensure we maximise use of the resources available to us in 2013-14 and to proactively manage the flexibility provided under the budget exchange mechanism agreed between Her Majesty's Treasury and the devolved administrations. I confirm, in line with past years, that it is my intention to make a statement to Parliament prior to the summer recess on provisional outturn in respect of both our Scottish Parliament budget and HM Treasury budget. The brief guide to the spring budget revision prepared by my officials sets out the background to and details of the main changes proposed, and I look forward to answering questions this morning.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. As is the usual format, I will ask a couple of questions and I'll open the session out to colleagues round the table. You touched, Cabinet Secretary, on capital there, and indeed the spring budget revision states that table 1.7 on page 11 of the SBR provides a complete picture of capital spending. However, table 1.7 doesn't really allow for establishing a picture of resource to capital transfer by portfolio. In other words, what resource budgets have fallen to accommodate the capital increases, or what changes have taken place since the plans were set out in draft budget 2014-15. So I'm just wondering if you could provide us with some information on that.
What I'd say, Convener, is that I think the best point at which for me to give definitive information to the committee on the resource to capital transfers is when we're in a position to assess by portfolio totals, is essentially when we are dealing with the outturn situation after the end of the financial year. We gave an estimate. I think the latest figures that were provided were in response to an oral question in October 2012, S40-01396, and that information is publicly available. I think to restate those during the financial year, I think would run the risk of essentially putting additional numbers into the discussion at a portfolio level when we are still essentially working on the actual operational decisions that are taken around capital expenditure and the likely outturn of particular programmes. So yeah, I felt it was helpful to the committee to give the assessment that I currently hold, that I estimate that the resource to capital transfer will be of the order of £220 million at a global level within the budget. But of course, as I've indicated in my statement, I will make a more comprehensive explanation of that by portfolio when it comes to the outturn statement after the end of the financial year.
I mean, I think that's very helpful. I just think, that the SBR shouldn't really say that it, and I quote, provides a complete picture of capital spending. So I think perhaps there should be a wee bit of rephrasing in terms of this in the future. I'm just wondering regarding health and well-being. I understand there's a net revenue to capital transfer for NHS and special health boards of about £95 million, detailed on page 20. That compares to £105 million in the draft budget. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a wee bit just about why that change has been made.
Well, essentially, Convener, the estimate that we have from the health and wellbeing portfolio is that most of the resource to capital transfer activity that was to be undertaken by that portfolio would be in relation to addressing the backlog of maintenance in the NHS estate. As the committee will be familiar, and I think I've rehearsed this issue with the committee before, maintenance expenditure doesn't always, although we all think of it as capital expenditure, sometimes it has to be defined as operating expenditure, as resource expenditure. Perhaps the best illustration of that is in relation to the work to maintain the road infrastructure. Literally, the definition of what counts as capital and what counts as resource depends on how far you have to dig into the road, and so that these judgments can be affected by the nature of the maintenance activity that we actually undertake. And in the health and wellbeing portfolio, their current estimate is that they reckon they will require to transfer £95 million to capital, although they will be undertaking the £105 million of maintenance expenditure that was envisaged at the time of the budget being settled earlier last year.
Okay, thank you very much for that. First person in the committee to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet, you mentioned the change to the local government portfolio in relation to police authorities' historic reserves. You mentioned that there was a process involving COSLA. Just for absolute clarity on the record, this is a process that's agreed with COSLA?
Yes, we can.
And presumably, and you can confirm if this is the case, this is a sort of technical matter wound up with the change in structure to the police that was agreed by Parliament. That being the case, this won't actually have any actual effect on local government spending power, presumably?
Well, what's happened here is that over time, the government and local government historically funded police authorities by a proportion of 51-49, and as a, and obviously police boards at local level had the ability to retain reserves. As it became clear that Parliament was going to agree to the establishment of the single police service, we opened discussions with local government about the accumulation of reserves, which clearly had been roughly 50% produced by local government, or contributed by local government, 50% by the Scottish Government. We reached a settlement with local government on that point to essentially return the accumulated reserves once a variety of different factors had been and costs had been met at local level to both local government and to the Scottish Government. So the local authorities would have received a roughly equivalent sum to the sum that the government has received, and obviously that's a matter for local government to handle and to deal with as they see fit.
So if we hadn't changed the police, so essentially a bit of a windfall for local government. You could
it could be described as that, I suppose, yes.
And obviously you'll be aware, as I'm a member of the Welfare Reform Committee, I've got an interest in that area, and I see that money's been transferred from Infrastructure Investment Cities portfolio to local government. I presume that's money that you've talked about previously. Can you? It's £37.9 million. Can you give us a sort of rough figure in terms of, with that contribution, what does this now take the Scottish Government's overall investment in welfare reform mitigation up to now?
That transfer is made from the Infrastructure Investment in Cities portfolio, where it sits under the budget line welfare reform mitigation, and paid to local government to enable local government to take forward measures such as the Scottish Welfare Fund. At a global level, the total expenditure, taking into account discretionary housing payments, council tax, the expenditure in the council tax reduction scheme and various other measures, will be taking that expenditure on an annual basis to in excess of £100 million. And obviously the government's made commitments to sustain that expenditure over time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Gavin.
Thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I refer you to page 16 of the spring budget revision, please? In the bottom of the two tables, there's a line for energy, which is a total of £52.9 million.
Can we just pause a second
Sure.
on page numbering, because I think we're on. Could you perhaps give me the
It's schedule 3.4. It's page 16 on the document I've got.
I'm with you.
Okay. Bottom table there, energy. There's a figure of £52.9 million. I compared that to the original budget, which was £115.9 million, and the autumn budget revision, where it was £68.8 million. So I'm just wondering if you can explain why it's now £52.9 million.
That will essentially be because of the difficulties and challenges that we have experienced in releasing expenditure to the Renewable Energy Investment Fund. I've made clear to Parliament on a number of occasions the issues that we are wrestling with in terms of projects coming forward for investment, which is largely caused by the uncertainty over electricity market reform, which has been a persistent factor we've been wrestling with for the best part of the last 24 months. And that's resulted in essentially an insufficient pipeline of projects coming to the stage that we could have that we can fund. We've exploring different opportunities within the market for support, but we haven't had a sufficient pipeline of projects at a stage ready for us to fund, and that's largely attributed to the issues of electricity market reform.
If you go to the level 4 data for that heading, though, when you initially published your budget, there would appear to be 8 headings under energy. I just wonder if you're in a position to tell us how it affects each of those headings, or can you provide that information in writing?
Certainly provide that information. I don't have level 4 in front of me
Sure.
today, but I'm very happy to provide that.
I'd be
Yes.
grateful for that. You're saying there isn't a sufficient pipeline of projects at the moment. The money that's been removed from energy, which is clearly substantial, is that reinstated to energy in future budgets, or is that effectively gone, as it were?
Well, I have an obligation under the Energy Act to ensure that any monies made available under the Renewable Energy Investment Fund are used for the purposes of that fund. So we have to, whatever we take out, we put the sums of money into the budget at the most appropriate opportunity we consider when we're setting budgets that expenditure may be required. That is by its nature an estimate based on when we think projects will crystallise to a point of meriting and attracting funding. Unfortunately, we won't get all those predictions correct, so we use the opportunities to redeploy those resources so they can be used to support other priorities. But there is a commitment that the resources that have been allocated to the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, which totals £103 million, must be spent on that purpose over time. And as I've indicated to Parliament, I think as I probably indicated to Parliament in my last statement on budget-related issues and in-year expenditure changes, that I would be reprofiling and extending the period within which I expected the Renewable Energy Investment Fund to be deployed.
What about monies that were originally under the energy heading that weren't part of REIF? Would that be reinstated in future?
Well, it depends what those projects were intended, or those budget headings were intended to support. If if there's a demand-led budget, for example, and demand has not been at a level that's equalled what we planned for, and we can't spend the money on that purpose, then I will clearly redeploy that in some other area of expenditure within government, and it would be a matter for us to consider in any future budget rounds or in future spending reviews as to whether or not we made further provision in those areas of activity. But those are decisions that we would arrive at on an annual basis in relation to a budget, or on a periodic basis for a spending review.
Okay, can we move on to page 20 of the document? It's Schedule 3.1, which is health. Fairly low down that page, there's a heading, miscellaneous other services, and the figure attached to that is £130 million. When I compare that to the autumn budget review, that figure was 100.
Give us
Sure, of course.
a second to just the.
You got it? It's £130 million. When I compare that to the autumn budget revision, that figure appeared to be £157 million. So while miscellaneous is no doubt miscellaneous, I just felt a reduction of £27 million. I just wonder if you're able to, either now or again in writing, shed any light on that.
The implications of that, well, I think I'll probably have to write to the committee about that. It's not immediately obvious to me what the relationship of the numbers will be, but I'm very happy to write to the committee on that point.
Okay, I'll move on then. Page 39 of the document, Schedule 3.9. Very near the bottom of that page, Scottish Prison Service current expenditure. Figure attached to that is £266 million. Again, at the time of the autumn budget revision, that figure was £296 million. So Scottish Prison Service current expenditure appears to have gone from 296 to 266. Again, I just wonder if you can shed any light.
Yeah, what's
on
happening here is that essentially the prison service would have been envisaged to make transfers from resource to capital, which I have been able to fund by transfers from other portfolios to deal with that capital requirement. And with the resource expenditure that has been able to be freed up within the prison service budget, I have redeployed that to meet a change in the profile of the cost of police pensions, police and fire pensions, where we are seeing during the financial year more retiring police officers due to the low interest rate climate in which we're operating, opting for a greater proportion of pension entitlement in lump sum as opposed to in recurring payments. So as a consequence of that, we clearly have to meet that short-term resource pressure that emerges because of the choices made by retiring officers in the police and fire service, and the prison service, the adjustments that I've made to the balance between resource and capital expenditure there have enabled me to meet that particular pressure.
On the pensions point, we're paying more now in lump sums, but the profile over time then reduces because, okay. All right. All right, can we go to page 73 of the document, please? Schedule 3.1, administration. there's a line there again in the second of the two tables. Scottish Government staff costs, 164.8 million. Again, I compared that to the figure at the time of the autumn budget revision, and that figure was 149.9 million. So are you able to explain the increase in that figure?
What that will be is us factoring in various elements of expenditure from different programmes of activity that essentially get presented in this number, although they're taking place in other parts of government, but are subsumed within the administrative budget at this time of year.
Are you able to explain that further? That I didn't quite follow that.
Well, essentially what we have, certain items of expenditure are undertaken by different parts of government under what's called programme budgets, which are essentially portfolio activities, and we will subsume some of that expenditure within this line. And I think, if my memory serves me right, we've gone through this issue before in the committee at spring budget revision, because it's always a number that is different from the autumn budget revision. And we are simply taking items of expenditure that would normally be allocated under a programme budget heading and deploying them in the administration heading here.
Does that mean that there'd be a requisite reduction in other parts of government then, if you like?
Well, it's essentially the same amount of money that's just been spent through a different channel than been spent through the programme budgets that are involved.
Okay, given the size of it, I mean, it's the best part of 10% of the staff cost budget. Is it possible to give us a breakdown of where that money has come from and which other programs? If not now, again, in writing?
Yeah, happy to do
Yes.
that, yeah.
Okay. And one more, if I may, Convener, just the page 69, so go back a few pages now on the Parliamentary Business and Government Strategy, Schedule 3.14. The last heading there, again on the second table, referendum on Scottish independence, 0.6 million. Now, there was a press release from the Scottish Government yesterday about the costs of the white paper and various other items of expenditure. That yesterday's figure was a higher figure than 0.6, so I'm assuming it's not coming from that budget. So is some of the figure from yesterday coming from that budget, or is it all coming from a different budget line? I wasn't able to tell.
The £405,000 of the announcement made yesterday is coming from the line which involves the £8.4 million transfer from other SG portfolios for social advertising and public information in 2013-14. So some of the costs are subsumed within that number, which now becomes £11.9 million as a consequence of a wider transfer of £8.4 million, which relates to a whole variety of public information campaigns, including road safety, detect cancer early, credit union support, healthier choices, infection control, and a variety of other public information campaigns.
Okay, so just for clarity, the money referred to yesterday would be, is that the strategic communication line, which is 11.9 million on
It features in, it's part of the strategic communications line that reaches £11.9 million. It's driven by the transfer in the top part of that page, which is transfers from other SG portfolios for social advertising and public information in 2013-14.
So all of the money in the press release yesterday would be in that in that one line. There aren't other lines it could be found in, for example. It's not split across different budget lines.
From the information that I have available to me, there may be some in the strategic comms line, and there may be some in the referendum on Scottish independence. I think, to be on the safe side, I better say it's in either of those two. But it certainly won't be any more than that.
Okay, I'm grateful. Thank you.
Of course, I think it should be put on the record that a very full and clear explanation of the costs involved was given in a parliamentary answer yesterday.
John. Thanks, Convener. It was just Cabinet Secretary to ask a little bit of clarification about some of the technical adjustments that appear, and I realise on your, I think it's Annex B, they total 24.7. I realise that they don't involve cash, but a couple of figures I was just wondering if you could maybe clarify for us. One is, it says justice allocation non-cash DEL 12.8 million, which also, the same figure appears on page 36, schedule 3.6.
Just, could you give me that number again, Mr. Mason?
Yes, 12.8 million. It's one of the summary of bigger figures in the technical changes section.
This is essentially to deal with the management of the year-end risk on impairments across the physical assets of the justice portfolio. Clearly, the justice portfolio has a significant estate footprint, and large parts of that have been either renewed or developed, particularly with new buildings being developed at Her Majesty's Prison Grampian and the Scottish Crime Campus. So that essentially this is us making provision for some of the impairments that will be associated with the asset valuations of the existing prison estate, or the existing justice estate, and particularly the new premises at HMP Grampian and the Scottish Crime Campus.
So would that mean maybe that a building that was being gradually depreciated, it's now worth less than it had been in the books?
It's essentially us trying to get in alignment our accounting treatment for the valuation of properties.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, also in the same kind of section, we have what was a total of 113.9 million, which is said technical adjustments to line budgets with accounting requirements. And in the notes, I think your officials had provided in paragraph 15, it gives some of the detail of that. And one, for example, is it says the substantive adjustments of this nature include the alignment of IFRS-based budgets for PPP PFI schemes, 54.4 million. So I was just wondering if you could maybe explain what that 54.4 million is.
Essentially, this is to under IFRS, we are obliged to budget and account to the Scottish Parliament for PPP and PFI arrangements in accordance with the Government Financial Reporting Manual. This is in line with the expectations of Audit Scotland in terms of the transparency between budgets and accounts. We essentially have to follow in here the combination of that factor and the consolidated budgeting guidance that's published by Her Majesty's Treasury, and we have to ensure that our accounts are consistent with IFRS requirements, which of course have been applied to the budget provision in a budget neutral fashion. So it's simply in terms of a kind of consistent presentation and preparation of the material. So these are essentially accounting adjustments for how we present particular costs in line with the budgeting guidance that we are required to follow by either Audit Scotland or Her Majesty's Treasury, depending on the particular presentation of the accounts that we're making.
Yes. So is this still stemming from the fact that it was thought that PFI schemes could be kept off the balance sheet altogether, and we are now, to some extent, suffering or having to make sure that they are in the balance sheet because they always were and always will be real liabilities?
But I think the short answer is yes. That in all honesty, although these projects may have appeared as distant, as remote from government, ultimately government was paying the costs. So the relationship was an awful lot more direct than I think it was made out to be. So the short answer is yes to that point.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, thank you, John. That has concluded the questions from the committee, Cabinet Secretary. We now move to agenda item 3, which is consideration of the motion on the order. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S4M-09255 that the Finance Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2013 Amendment Order 2014 be approved. Do members have any further comments? They do not. I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S4M-09... Sorry? You moved it?
I think I need to move it.
Sorry.
Don't think I quite got around to that, Kabir, but just, if it's helpful, I move the Finance Committee...
It was chuntering, never mind. Okay, apologies. Right, I now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S4M-09255 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Members have indicated their agreement. The committee now publish a short report to the Parliament setting out our decision on the order. Okay, well, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. I'll now suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes to allow the changeover of witnesses. Thank you. Okay, is everyone ready? Our fourth item of business today is to continue our Stage 1 consideration of the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill. And today we will take evidence from the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland. I'd therefore like to welcome to the meeting Philip Simpson and James Wolfe, QC of the Faculty of Advocates, and Alan Barrett and Isabel Dinverno of the Law Society of Scotland. And there being no opening statements, we'll go straight to questions from myself, followed by members of the committee. Most of you have been here before, so you'll know the drill. Okay, so let's get started then. Just, I'll start with the faculty of advocates, basically, in terms of the submission. I have to say, I'm impressed by the submissions. I think they were very concise, but covered a lot of ground, actually, which I'm sure we will delve into in great detail. But just to go on to paragraph 9, first of all, which is appeals to the Court of Session. The submission states, and I quote, that the faculty recognises the policy issues behind restricting appeals to the Court of Session to cases raising important issues of principle or practice, or in which there is some other compelling reason for allowing the appeal to proceed. However, the faculty is concerned that this may unduly restrict the right of individual litigants to have access to the Supreme Court in Scotland. I wonder if you could explain to us why that would be necessary, and how long would someone have to wait before their case came up to the Court of Session?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Perhaps I could preface my direct answer to that question by observing that the bill proposes to establish a system of tribunals in which there will first of all be a first-tier tribunal of sitting with up to 3 members, then an appeal to the upper tribunal, which is, as I read the bill, required to sit with a single member who may or may not be qualified in Scots law and who may or may not have greater tax experience or expertise than the members who sat in the first-tier tribunal. And there's perhaps a separate point that the committee might wish to consider around whether it's appropriate at least to allow the upper tribunal to sit with more than one member. Otherwise, one has the odd situation where you have a decision by 3 people going up on appeal to a decision by a single individual. And it's in that context that one then looks at the onward appeal to the inner house. Now, the restricted access to the inner house, the test that is articulated in the bill, is one which has been described as a second-tier appeals test, and it is a necessary consequence of that test that in an individual case, the tribunal, in this case the upper tribunal, may have got it wrong, but nevertheless you cut off the right of appeal if there's no point of general importance in the case. And that's a deliberate, if that's enacted, that's a deliberate decision being taken to say we will live with mistakes, even if they're perhaps relatively obvious mistakes, simply to, as it were, avoid the possibility of a litigant having yet another bite at the cherry. It's important, I think, that the committee understands that the nature of the test that is applied is deliberately to exclude a well-founded appeal, even a well-founded appeal which is perhaps reasonably it's reasonably clear that there's at least a seriously good point to be argued. And if all the litigants can say is this is really important to me, the tribunal's got it wrong, you'll still not get leave because it the case doesn't raise a general point, a point of general importance. So the question really is it right to say to a taxpayer, or it may be Revenue Scotland on the other side, but perhaps thinking about the taxpayer, say to a taxpayer, but we're content that the system may have got it wrong, but nevertheless we're not going to let you appeal to Scotland's Supreme Court. And particularly in a context where the upper tribunal decision may have been made by a single individual who may or may not be qualified in Scots law, may or may not be as well qualified as the first-tier tribunal, I'd suggest that that restriction is something the committee should be concerned about.
Yes, I noticed your comments on that your submission, but how long would someone have to wait before the case was heard at the Court of Session?
I don't have the current statistics on waiting times. An appeal to the inner house from a statutory tribunal there's a statutory period of time within which that has to be taken, and we can provide that information after the hearing. It's then a question of the time that it takes from the appeal being, as it were, lodged to the point where it's heard and then determined by the court. The Inner House has made significant improvements in its internal procedures in the relatively recent relatively recent past, and it's certainly the perception of practitioners that a problem that formerly existed of delay in getting appeals heard is no longer the case. Effectively, the way it now works is the Inner House insists on cases being front-loaded much more than used to be the position, and it's certainly my perception that the time to get a case to a hearing is much quicker than it used to be.
Rather than years, then?
It certainly wouldn't be years. I mean, you might run from one year into the next, depending when in the year the appeal was marked. That would certainly be my perception.
Yeah.
I don't know, Philip, whether you've any different experience.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think the other point I would make in the particular context of the currently devolved taxes is that the amount of litigation that would end up in the Court of Session would be very low in any event. As I mentioned in the submission, since the First-Tier Tribunal, the UK First-Tier Tribunal came into existence about 4 or 5 years ago, there have only been each year about 50 or 60 cases proceeding before it. And that's, of course, across the whole gamut of UK taxes. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if there have been any cases involving stamp duty land tax or landfill tax raised in the First-Tier Tribunal. So certainly broadening the possibility of an appeal to the Court of Session wouldn't open any sort of floodgates that would have any material impact on the workload of the Inner House.
Thank you for that. I'm going to touch on the issue of privilege. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't really see it in the submissions because we have a solicitor and an accountant actually on the committees, which is interestingly enough. But you'll have known that the CIOT and ICAS are very strong in terms of extending privilege beyond the legal profession in terms of taxation. What's the view of the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland on that?
Well, I'm happy to lead off on that. I think one has to, well, the clue is perhaps in the name. It's legal professional privilege. It's a privilege that attaches when people seek and take legal advice to allow for the candid provision of information to the legal advisor and the candid giving of appropriate advice. It is a special privilege. It's there for very good reason, but it is important that it be confined. If one expands it beyond the regulated professions whose job it is to give legal advice, then where does one draw the boundary? One has to remember tax advice, if one's looking at it in the broad sense, can be given by entirely unregulated, unqualified people. So I would invite the committee to take the clue from the name and recognise the importance of seeing it as a privilege that attaches to legal advice given by qualified legal advisors.
Our accountancy friend wants to come in just before you do, Alan.
If I could just clarify on that point, thanks, Convener, for opportunity to ask a supplementary. So are you saying that if it was non-legal advice given by a legal advisor, that should not be privileged? Would you accept that?
I'd have to. I'm not going to give the committee legal advice off the cuff in public, if I can give it that way. I'd want to go and remind myself of the ambit of the privilege before I just give a comment on that. I'm not trying to be difficult about it.
Okay, sorry, Alan.
Not at all. I think it's the Law Society of Scotland, perhaps unsurprisingly, would support the restriction as currently exists. Indeed, of course, recently confirmed in the Supreme Court for the UK. I should also say that our representation includes both a lawyer and a chartered accountant as well. So this is not purely from the legal point of view. I think, I mean, if one was looking for kind of origins and demands for it, I think the words officer of the court are important. Well, it's not, I think, restricted to things that, of course, do end up in court or even that could end up in court. It is that notion of being given, of being able to give candid advice and receive candid information in a situation where the citizen finds himself or herself liable to prosecution or other proceedings, that demands that freedom from that advice being produced, as it were, against them.
Okay. Yeah,
and if
sure.
I can just, I'm not sure I would necessarily even characterise it as a restriction on the privilege. It's the logic of the privilege that it attaches to legal advice, and therefore that it's concerned with advice sought and taken from those professions who are regulated for the giving and of legal advice, and as Alan's observed, ultimately for either pursuing or defending proceedings, should proceedings arise.
Okay, I won't press this matter. Colleagues may wish to round the table. General anti-avoidance, obviously, it features both your submissions, and you're both saying things very much along similar lines. You know, paragraph 22 of your submission, the Law Society of Scotland says in its first line, we are concerned at the lack of certainty inherent in the GAR provisions. And in the paragraph 13 of the Faculty of Advocates submission, you point out that you would like to see the general anti-avoidance rule being more certain for both taxpayers and Revenue Scotland. I think one of the issues about certainty, though, is the issue that the way the law is sometimes interpreted is that it can be too certain, in that the general, unless the wording of legislation is absolutely perfect, then the difficulty then is that it can allow loopholes and potential avoidance, because there is no flexibility in terms of how the law is applied. In other words, quite clearly when there is an intention, and I've quoted a case before on this particular issue, when an intention is made, it can still be circumvented if the certainty is too tight. So how tight do we actually draw this? Because, you know, speaking as someone, as a layperson, one could say, in terms of being a taxpayer, I think what annoys the public more than anything else is that they see a lot of people using avoidance and loopholes to avoid paying their fair share, which obviously, all else being equal, burdens the rest of the population who do pay their fair share. So I think that I certainly have a concern about the tightening up to make things more certain, regardless of what Adam Smith may have said in a previous century. You know, so I'm just wondering if the Law Society of Scotland and Faculty of Advocates could expand a wee bit more on your submissions in this particular area.
Yes, I think, I mean, we recognise that this is a difficult line to draw, and I think for the Law Society of Scotland, we fully accept and have accepted in relation to the equivalent UK statute the absolute need, an understandable need, to stamp out unacceptable avoidance. I mean, best characterised by circular transactions which create a non-economic loss, for example, that leads nonetheless to a tax deduction, which, you know, through a long history of the courts proved extremely difficult without a general anti-avoidance or anti-abuse rule, as it is in the UK, to stamp out. And I think that this needs to be stamped out, and we can understand why either legislature wishes to do so. And we also appreciate that absolute certainty is impossible in tax legislation, particularly in a a world whose economics are rather more complicated than those in the days of Adam Smith. So the question, it seems to us, is much more about where the certainty has to come from is production of enough evidence of what will or will not be regarded as falling within these general rules without the need to, as it were, further complicate the general rules by saying this and this and this is disqualified or qualifies. That's what it needs by way of guidance, so that people can be told, we at Revenue Scotland regard this as falling within these provisions, this kind of transaction, and we would pursue that on this basis. And perhaps even more importantly, to white label, as it's called, things that would definitely not fall within these provisions, so that people can proceed with these in the knowledge that they are not going to be challenged at a later date. We've also advocated that on this, it is perhaps understandable that Revenue Scotland would wish to be the ones making the sole decision in this, but we rather support a more independent view of what would be reasonable in these circumstances, which is why I think we do still recommend an expert panel of some description to give advice on what's available. But I don't think that this necessarily would lead to any change in the legislation as proposed. It is the guidance around it that is particularly important. We note, and it's a policy decision, that the restoration of the word anti-avoidance as opposed to anti-abuse, which is how it was eventually legislated in the UK, is quite deliberate, and that's a policy decision again we can understand. But it certainly leads to a perception, no doubt a deliberate perception, that it is intended to be wider than its UK equivalent, to catch more things, to put it simply. And again, that is fine, that's a matter for policy, but it probably adds even more, if there is to be a difference with the UK provision, to that need for the certainty that guidance will provide, rather than tightening of the legislation.
That's very interesting. Isabel?
If I could just add to that, the big advantage of having an external panel is that people involved in it would have commercial experience of a wide range of transactions and actings and so on, and would therefore be perhaps better able to determine whether something was an unusual way of behaving, or whether it was in fact just the way that the property industry is now doing a particular type of transaction because of the changing economic circumstances in which we find ourselves, or because of pressures from other parts of the legislation which affect the way in which transactions are done. And that's a particular aspect of all of this which is difficult to get a grasp of, unless there is very good guidance, or an external body to which you can apply to have a view. Most business transactions will have a tax element in them, and most business decisions will pay attention to tax. I think you have to allow taxpayers to make a tax-flavoured decision, as John Whiting has referred to it, without worrying that because they have taken tax into account, they're falling foul of the GAR. So it's really trying to give taxpayers more certainty in how the GAR will apply, rather than tightening up the legislation, because, as you said, that will just lead to loopholes being created.
Sorry,
You don't need to do that. Sorry, it comes on automatically.
Thank you.
You're not a veteran like Isabel of the committee.
So perhaps I can just make a couple of observations about certainty, and I do so against the background of recognising the policy significance of, as Alan's observed, dealing with transactions which are, on a proper view of it, abusive or illicit avoidance. We tend to think of certainty as having a constitutional significance. The notion of the rule of law is that individuals in their dealings with the state should be able to plan their affairs with a reasonable confidence that they can predict the way that the rules will be applied to them once they've taken appropriate advice. So there's that constitutional dimension to trying to find mechanisms which give a sufficient measure of certainty to taxpayers. That value, which we tend to think of as part of the rule of law, also has an economic significance. And there's now a literature about the way in which the rule of law and its institutions promote economic success. Because unless economic actors have a reasonable measure of certainty in carrying out their affairs, in making decisions, or at least are able to achieve a reasonable measure of certainty by taking advice and being able to ascertain how rules will be applied to them, perfectly legitimate innovation may be deterred, and so there is a real significance in any system of seeking to identify and create mechanisms which provide a reasonable measure of certainty, recognizing that nothing, absolute certainty is never possible. And it's against that background that the faculty also would support the use of an advisory panel, first of all, to help introduce a measure of certainty, but also to give that, as it were, external and independent input into decisions that may be made. So that's my take on it. Philip, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yes, I would. Comparing the proposed Scottish GAR with the UK GAR, of course, Scottish GAR is intended to be rather wider. The UK GAR is quite a narrow one, and I suspect that the band of uncertainty within which the line will be drawn, as time goes by, as we see cases coming through, is a fairly narrow one. And so, yes, there is uncertainty about precisely where it will be drawn, but the degree of uncertainty is reasonably limited, I think, at least compared to the uncertainty as regards where the line may be drawn with the proposed Scottish GAR, because one can see that the band of transactions that might be regarded as falling within it or on one line or the other is a much wider band, and therefore there seems to me to be a higher degree of uncertainty as to how the proposed Scottish GAR would actually operate in practice. For that reason, I would think that something like an advisory panel where one has, in effect, 3 expert witnesses giving an advanced view would assist, particularly if, as with the UK GAR, they are required to publish guidance I think they're required to publish annual guidance about decisions that they made on an anonymous basis. And we can therefore build up a corpus of decisions that have been that indicate where the line will be drawn in any particular case. So far as guidance by Revenue Scotland is concerned, yes, it would be helpful, and I think the idea is that Revenue Scotland would self-publish guidance, and that will, of course, likewise, well, at least give a certainty as to where Revenue Scotland thinks the line will be drawn, or ought to be drawn. And that does, I think, lead into one particular question, which is that as the legislation is currently drafted, the Court is required to take into account any guidance by Revenue Scotland in setting out how the GAR should be operated. That's slightly unusual because, of course, we have this idea of the separation of powers at constitutional level, whereby the executive are not really supposed to be the ones who interpret legislation, and that's a matter for the judiciary. It does seem to be, on the face of it, an inroad into that principle, the separation of powers, in effect giving particular necessary weight to the executive's view as to how what is a fairly, what is a broadly drafted and on its own quite flexible and elastic provision should be interpreted. So while I think the faculty supports an advisory panel plus Revenue Scotland guidance, I'm not so sure we support the proposition that the court should be required to take that into account in interpreting and applying the GAR.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think Mr. Wolfe touched on it when he said reasonable measure of certainty. It's how you define that reasonable measure. I think what we don't want to see is every I dotted and every T crossed, because that's what can cause the difficulties. But I realise other committee members are keen to come in, so I'm not going to abuse my position in the chair. I'm just going to ask point one other area, which is you mentioned twice actually in the Law Society submission, which is in paragraphs 29 and 40 under sections 6 and 8, and that is you say in paragraph 29, we do question the introduction of a general unjustified enrichment defence for Revenue Scotland across all devolved taxes, when to date the same has been restricted to specific taxes in the UK context. I'm not really sure why anyone would be against unjustified enrichment, because the word there is unjustified. So I wonder if you can talk to that. And also in paragraph 40 you say there are co-paste provisions in the bill to prevent unjustified enrichment of the taxpayer. We see absolutely no reason why they should not be balanced by provisions against the unjustified enrichment to the tax authority. So I'm just wondering if you can talk to this unjustified enrichment area.
I mean, the area involved, I suspect it is little affected by the initially devolved taxes. It's more commonly found in some of the UK taxes. But the notion, I mean, it is best seen in relation to the pay-as-you-earn system, whereby there is a responsibility put on the employer, a separate responsibility from the actual tax charge, to deduct and pay over to the revenue authorities the employee's tax. And if the employer fails to do this, then is subject to the tax being collected and penalties and interest in the normal tax enforcement procedure. And it is in practice, although in theory not, taken into account whether the employee has in fact already paid that tax and that interest, and to avoid the need for that interest and that kind of thing. So because of these separate obligations, there are situations in which the state can end up, as it were, collecting twice. Now, one taxpayer has made a mistake, but his fault has been made up by another taxpayer. And I mean, it's not impossible to envisage that in the land and buildings transaction tax system, for example, where somebody else could have paid what was primarily one taxpayer's responsibility. So I think our point is that this should be balanced. In other words, it should indeed be a factor, certainly as regards penalties, but probably as regards tax as well, whether the amount of tax in question has actually been collected from another taxpayer, perhaps incorrectly. In other words, they should balance each other out. That was the thrust of these provisions, of our suggestions there.
Bill, do you want to add anything to that now?
I think in UK taxes, it also comes up in relation to VAT. It's a feature of that tax, but there can be problems in practice of establishing whether or not there has been unjust enrichment in relation to the taxpayer trying to claim a relief or whatever it is, because practically what has happened, looking back at transactions and trying to figure it out. So I think we thought that there were some dangers in applying it across the board, that it might cause... It's another way of involving uncertainty, because you might only, as the taxpayer, be able to go down a particular road if you could demonstrate that there hadn't been undue unjust enrichment. So I think those were the thoughts.
Does Mr Simpson, do you have a view on that?
Yes, if I could just add in, the provisions are quite clearly based on UK tax provisions, which are applied tax by tax, depending on whether it's not appropriate for them to apply one tax which they apply as value-added tax, another tax which they apply as landfill tax. And that's because of the way landfill tax actually operates in practice. In practice, landfill tax is paid by the operator of a landfill site, who charges for his services, or her services, to the people who actually deposit landfill or waste to be put into the site. The landfill operator may make a separate entry in his invoice to the person depositing the waste, specifically for the landfill tax, because landfill tax is simply charged by the tonne on the amount you put into the site, depending on the nature of the waste involved. So in that context, one can see quite clearly the potential for unjustified enrichment of a person who's actually paid the tax, because the landfill site operator simply takes the money that they've received from the person whose waste it is and passes it on to HMRC. If all HMRC does, if it's been wrongly collected, is pass the money back to the operator of the site, and the operator of the site then retains it, then one can see that's unjustified, because it's not an amount that the operator has actually borne. And that's why, in those circumstances, one can enter into reimbursement arrangements between the operator and the person who's deposited the waste, in effect requiring the operator, if they do receive any money from HMRC, to pass it back to the person who has deposited the waste. And in that way, unjustified enrichment is avoided. There's still the opportunity to recover unlawfully levied tax, or tax that was not due but was paid from HMRC. So it is in UK tax quite a specific instrument to deal with the specific way that taxes operate. VAT is the other obvious example, because there, of course, it is again an indirect tax, and the tax is actually borne by the consumer of goods and not by the taxable person who pays the VAT to HMRC. So again, if VAT has been paid that wasn't due, if it's simply returned to the taxable person, that person receives, in effect, a windfall, because they've got the money from the consumer and they've got the money from HMRC, so they've got two lots of VAT instead of one. And so again, there, one can enter into reimbursement arrangements, and that is a necessary condition of seeking to recover VAT that hasn't been due from HMRC. So it really is those sort of specific scenarios to do with the structure of the tax at which the provisions on unjustified enrichment are directed, whereas as the Law Society suggests, in the different contexts of PAYE, for example, it's a much more complex area that doesn't necessarily comfortably fit with the broad unjustified enrichment rules that are set out in the bill. Clearly one would support, or one would be against the idea that a taxpayer, by receiving a repayment from Revenue Scotland, should somehow make a windfall gain. But it's perhaps more appropriate to think about how that might be done on a tax-by-tax basis, rather than by general rules that fit with specific taxes, but not necessarily with all taxes.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to open up questions to the rest of the committee. The first person to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you, Camille. I want to return to this issue of privilege. The Chartered Institute of Taxation Institute of Chartered Accountants expressed their concern to this committee that it gives a competitive advantage to the legal profession as opposed to their position. Just wonder what your perspective is on that.
Well, I suppose I just come back to the nature of the privilege. If the intrinsic nature of the privilege is that it is legal, professional privilege, then the logic of it is that it's a privilege that attaches to advice sought and taken from regulated legal professionals. And I suppose the consequential question is where ultimately do you draw the line, recognising that advice on all sorts of things, including advice on legal matters, provided it doesn't trench into certain very specific areas, it can be given by members of all sorts of professions and indeed members of no profession at all.
I think it would be misleading to suggest that most of the work of lawyers is involved in advising taxpayers on tax avoidance schemes. That's very far from the case. I think most tax advice is geared towards advising people how the tax implications of transactions that they're proposing to carry on, and to avoid elephant traps and to look into things and make reasoned decisions. So I just don't think we are aware of people flooding to lawyers' offices rather than accountants' offices in order to take tax advice because of the fact that legal privilege exists. I think that accountants get more than their fair share of tax advisory work, and most clients who are not obviously trying to do schemes that are beyond the pale will decide whether to take advice from a lawyer or an accountant on the basis of privilege. They'll take advice from whoever they think is going to best be able to advise them.
Now, you used an interesting term there, Mr. Inverno. You said schemes beyond the pale. Are you aware of any instances where this level of privilege has been used as a guise to devise avoidance schemes?
Well, I think we're all aware of situations where that's happened, because the case that's been in the news was about that very thing, wasn't it? That because advice was taken from accountants, not lawyers, should there have been privilege and so on. But it really is a very small part of the work that accountants and indeed lawyers in relation to tax are involved in most of the time. Whether or not this privilege is not at the forefront of people's minds when they're choosing a tax advisor.
Yes, I think I don't have any empirical evidence, but certainly my impression is that in the UK, most tax advice is in fact given by the accountancy profession, and so if the existence of privilege gives the legal profession a competitive advantage, it's not a very effective one. We must remember also that the case in the Supreme Court a couple of years ago that decided not to extend the scope of legal professional privilege to accountants was taken by Prudential Insurance plc, so obviously a very sophisticated user of legal and accountancy services, who nonetheless chose to get tax advice from an accountancy firm rather than from a legal firm, because I suppose that's where they thought they would get the best advice. And clearly Prudential must have been aware that advice from the accountancy firm would not, as law stood at that time, attract privilege, nonetheless chose to get the advice from the accountant. So I would suggest that the point that there's some competitive advantage isn't a terribly practical one.
But I mean, I do appreciate that evidence, and I think, to be fair, that was a point I made to the accountancy profession last week. You did ask the question, well, has this actively harmed the profession? And the answer did come back, not particularly. I think Elspeth Orchard, I'm just looking at the evidence last week, she did make the point someone might say they've never seen a starving accountant. So I suppose I wasn't meant as a jibe, sorry Mr Mason, but I suppose it makes the point that is this actually as big an issue as might first appear? But I still think it's important that we explore it. Can I turn to whether or not parts of this bill should be in primary legislation and secondary legislation? I think the Law Society's had something to say about this, and I think you've alluded to the fact that because some elements are to be dealt with secondary legislation, the bill cannot be said to have passed the test of certainty and convenience. I thought that was quite a bold thing to say, because surely it's more about the system that's put in place and whether it's there's certainty and convenience for taxpayers through the system that's put in place, rather than everything having to go in the face of primary legislation. I mean, would you accept that?
I think we accept that, absolutely. It wasn't a very big point. What we did notice, however, that the bill was, if anything, we fair to say it was slightly unbalanced. There are some things that are gone into in fairly great detail, in great slices of legislation, whereas there are other which will undoubtedly end up in the same kind of quantity of legislation, will be secondary. But I think that it is not a huge point. There is, on matters of principle in particular, and I think the bill does meet that criterion, it would be very much our view that that should always be in primary legislation, and it is much more for matters of detail, perhaps of procedure and things like that are much better suited to secondary legislation. I think we would be more concerned if there was huge use, and we're too early in the Scottish Parliament as a tax legislating parliament. We're too early in that procedure to know whether this is going to happen. We'd be more concerned if there was a lot of things that were put into secondary legislation as a matter of course.
Okay, that's helpful. You also turn to the other issue of tribunals that the convener raised. The Law Society say that there will be 4 forums of appeal in Scotland: first-tier tribunals, upper tribunals, Court of Session, Supreme Court. And you're saying that until now Scotland's had one less layer than England and not suffered from that. But our advisor says this puzzles him because the current layers are First Tier Tribunal, Upper Tribunal, Court of Appeal and Supreme Court in England. Can you comment on that?
I absolutely accept that. The comment was somewhat out of date until relatively recently, until the introduction of the First Tier Tribunal system. The Scottish system involved 3 layers and not 4, but we accept that they both have 4 at the moment. It's the preservation of 4, particularly in a small jurisdiction, that we are slightly questioning. Again, I would say this is not a huge point that we are concerned about.
The faculty are the opposite. You actively welcome the establishment of first instance and appellate tribunals for tax matters, but you do suggest that there could be confusion with the naming of them. Confusion between the UK system and the Scottish system. It might be quite interesting if you could just put a little bit more on the record in relation to that.
Yeah, well, certainly. The proposed system really reflects the current UK tribunal system for UK taxes. Since I think the 1st of April 2010, the system in Scotland was aligned with the system in England and Wales, whereby we had a first-tier tribunal, and then an upper tribunal, and then the Inner House of the Court of Session, and then the Supreme Court. Before then, you went directly from the Special Commissioners of the VAT Tribunal to the Inner House with no intermediate layer. In England, you had the intermediate layer. That's now been created in Scotland. There doesn't seem to be any problem with that system. I would, however, reiterate the comments of the Dean of Faculty to the fact that there isn't, I would suggest, a terribly positive reason for restricting appeals from the upper tribunal to the Inner House in the way that the legislation is currently drafted. But so far as the names are concerned, it just strikes me that it's almost inevitable that at some point some litigant will confuse which tribunal they should be appealing to, and in fact it's likely to be a litigant who has not a lot of tax at stake, who is unadvised. It's likely to be a sort of lower income type litigant, and it will simply create a procedural mess if an appeal is started in the wrong jurisdiction, or the form sent to the wrong address, and it will have to be sorted out, hopefully in one way or another. So just to avoid that confusion, I wondered if different names might be chosen, but if it's part, as I understand it, of the broader reform of the Scottish tribunal system, that may or may not be possible. But
I certainly think we can reflect on that and report that back. And similarly, you also, it was other matters you've put in a bit about how the Acts in this Act should be referred to the Land Building Transactions Tax Act and the Scottish Landfill Tax Act. They're obviously different years, and you've suggested they should be described differently in the bill. Again, what's the practical effect of this?
Well, it's just a minor drafting issue, because as one can anticipate that if further taxes become within the competence of the Scottish Parliament, it's plain that there's likely to be more than one act per year to do with the tax. So the shorthands that are used at the moment in tax law generally refer to or use the initials of the tax statute plus the year. So everyone knows that I-TOI 05 is Income Tax, Trading and Other Income Act 2005.
That's the case, actually, but I take the point.
Well, but yes, but the statute referred to as I-TOI or ITIPA or ETA or CTA 09 for the Corporation Tax Act 09. So that's just at least the form of abbreviation that everyone is used to, and works quite well when you start to have a proliferation of statutes rather than simply referring to the 2012 Act, because, well, speaking for myself, I have some difficulty remembering which Act was passed in which year. So if I'm given the additional help from the initials, that normally makes life a bit easier.
Make it easier for you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, no, I take the point, and we'll take that on board. Thank you.
Apologies. Malcolm, to be followed by John.
One of the issues you both expressed concern about is about the delegation of certain aspects of tax management to Revenue Scotland and SEPA. The Law Society goes as far as to question whether it's appropriate that Revenue Scotland is empowered to delegate any of its functions to those two agencies, and then the Faculty of Advocates is a bit more selective. So I wondered what the basis of your concerns was there.
It's not, again, it's not a major point, and the power is there, or at least it seems the power is there, simply to delegate. By any, we mean every aspect of it to the two agencies, and we wonder whether, in fact, it is appropriate that every aspect could be delegated, if that is what was chosen to be done in the future. Rather, if we're having a tax authority, then it should act as a tax authority, and I can well see. I mean, there's absolutely very good reason for delegating large quantities of administrative functions to other aspects of the administration of the transactions that are going on, a land and buildings transaction tax or a landfill tax transaction. It makes sense for the agencies involved in these transactions anyway also to be responsible for administration of the tax. But and I'm sure that is what is currently proposed and what's currently happening, but the power that is given is to delegate everything if Revenue Scotland wanted to either of those or indeed other agencies, and no doubt in due course. And that just struck us as a matter of principle as being a bit wide. That was the point.
You want to comment on that at all? Or?
So I think I would. Our point, in a sense, is really the same point, but perhaps put the other way around. That there are certain powers which are inherently powers of a taxing authority, the power to levy a penalty, power to make an assessment and the like, and one may have to be careful about permitting a taxing authority, as it were, carte blanche, to delegate whatever it likes to somebody else. I noticed that I've just turned up the provision on the GAR, and that provides in relation to authorised officers, that this can be a member of staff or Revenue Scotland or another person, presumably may not be a member of staff of Revenue Scotland. So it's perhaps part of the same question of whether there aren't functions in relation to the operation of the tax system which, being inherently part of what a taxing authority is there to do, shouldn't be retained by and exercised by the taxing authority, even if there is power to delegate certain functions. Philip, I don't know if you'd want to add anything to
Yes,
that.
I'd reiterate that I think there are basically core functions of a tax authority that ought to be exercised by that tax authority. One can think of imposition of penalties. Debt collection as well, I think, particularly once one starts to consider lower income taxpayers, so not necessarily people would be affected by the currently devolved taxes, but if we're thinking to the future and to taxes that might be devolved in the future, one can see that HMRC takes a very different attitude to debt collection to commercial debt collectors and is able to exercise a more flexible might not be the term, but a more sophisticated approach to people who are in serious difficulty, who are on low incomes, who are, for example, with repayments of tax credits and that sort of thing. So that's the sort of thing that would be much better kept within the tax authority, which has as part of its core functions.
Yes. I wonder if I might just add an additional comment, I apologise, which is this, that one has to remember that some of the powers of taxing authorities are intrusive in the sense they have rightly and properly in the public interest of investigative powers. The power to impose a penalty which is evidently what it says. It is important that these sorts of powers, when they're exercised by an organ of the state, are exercised by an organ of the state which has got the appropriate structures of accountability to be trusted with those sorts of intrusive and coercive authority. And it's in that context that I think one perhaps has to think carefully about which powers are powers which constitutionally should be exercised by the body which this Parliament is going to set up with the structures of accountability and responsibility which this Parliament considers as right for a taxing authority, and which powers this Parliament is content to allow that body to, in effect, hand off to someone else to exercise on its behalf.
That's interesting. I mean, so it sounds as if you would like the bill to be amended to make some of that more explicit, which of course leads to the more general question about what should be in the bill that's not in it. I mean, it's already been touched upon in your answers to Jamie Hepburn, but and I was going to ask about the GAR in relation to that, but there was one comment about the GAR that interested me. I think Mr. Simpson said he didn't think guidance should be taken into account by the courts, and it just made me wonder if are you basically saying that, I think you were worried probably about the powers, the discretion of Revenue Scotland there, but is the implication there that more of that kind of thing has to be in the bill, or that there has to be statutory guidance, or more of it has to be on the face of the bill, or did I pick you up wrongly?
The concern there is the constitutional one, that there is a separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary, which broadly means that it's not the executive who get to interpret the laws that they've had passed. I was looking for something in Adam Smith's Lecture on Jurisprudence this morning, but I couldn't quite download it properly onto my Kindle, so I didn't quite manage. But he was writing about the same time as Montesquieu, who came up with this idea. If the courts are required to take into account guidance given by Revenue Scotland as to where the line should be drawn, that conceivably gives Revenue Scotland, the executive branch, more power than it properly should have to determine how the rules are interpreted and applied in practice, beyond what one would normally anticipate, whereby that function is left to the judiciary. In reality, as matters stand, one of course looks to HMRC manuals to see what HMRC say about how a rule works. But it's not something that's given a great deal of weight by the tribunals or the courts. It's something that they can look at, but it can be regarded as simply what HMRC's line is, and it happens to be the same line as they're presenting in a particular case. Whereas the proposition that it's something that must be taken into account seems to elevate Revenue Scotland's view to something beyond its proper limits in the constitutional framework, where we do have a separation of powers in the UK.
But I mean, statutory guidance has a well-recognised role in legislation. So is that something different because it's coming from the government, or because it's because that?
I think it's the obligation of the court of the tribunal to take it into account, which perhaps elevates it. The suggestion might be that it may take it into account, may have regard to it, rather than must have regard to it.
That was really interesting. Again, just touching on really one of the first questions that the convener asked, I just wasn't quite clear. You talked about in your submission about the 50 or 60 decisions made by the first-tier tax tribunal in the recent 12-month period, and that you suggested that by implication then there wouldn't be a large number in Scotland, even if we had a larger number of devolved taxes. But I mean, are we comparing light with light there, or is it
To be clear, the 50 or 60 cases in the first-tier tribunal that I mentioned are in the first-tier tribunal sitting in Scotland across the whole gamut of UK taxes. So, including the, in particular, value-added tax, which is by far the most litigated tax in the UK. So that is perhaps the volume that could be anticipated where all taxes devolve to the Scottish Parliament. So far as land and buildings transaction tax and Scottish landfill tax are concerned, I say I haven't checked, but I'm not aware of any first-tier tribunal cases in either of those taxes on stamp duty land tax or landfill tax in the past 4 or 5 years. There's been certainly one landfill case in the landfill tax case in the Court of Session. That's been nothing technical. It's been a judicial review matter. But certainly, I wouldn't anticipate anything more than 2 or 3 cases, perhaps a year, in the first-tier tribunal on devolved taxes.
I think if I could just add to that, in relation to SDLT generally across the UK, there haven't been a huge number of cases. There have been quite a few penalty cases, and there have been the big, avoidance cases, but it's not been a huge stream. So, in relation to Scotland, I'm sure you could only expect quite a small number.
But I mean, in kind of way that connects with the other more general issue of to what extent this bill is a bill about 2 taxes, or whether it's a bill about several other taxes to come through one constitutional route or another. But anyway, sticking with tribunals, the Law Society seems to be concerned that the upper tribunal could have a single member judging the appeal at its second hearing. I mean, how does that compare with the existing arrangements, and what's your concern about that?
It's really the same concern as it was expressed by James earlier in relation to the nature of an appeal, which could be from up to 3 expert and specialists to a single member the member of the Upper Tax Tribunal. Now, we don't know for certain who these will be, but it need not be a particularly experienced tax judge. And there is something that just smells a little wrong about perhaps going from 2 or 3 experts to one, no doubt very highly qualified, but not necessarily as expert in the area, as a mechanism for appeal. It is not particularly different from where we are now, but it's...
Okay, thanks. I don't really know much about tax tribunals. That's perhaps fairly obvious, but the Faculty of Advocates suggest that parties should not be required to pay fees to the tribunal in relation to appeals, and that this is made clear in the bill. I mean, again, how does that compare with the current system? I don't know.
That's the current system. There are no fees payable to the tribunals, at least for raising appeals there.
They do pay fees?
No, there are no fees.
There are no fees at the moment, so this is a change that's being...
Yes, the fees were charged, that would be a change from the existing
Alright, okay.
system.
And that melts into comments that we made about the expenses system as well, where we are suggesting that unless one party is wholly unreasonable, then there should be a system of no expenses awarded against a party at the first-tier tribunal level. It's often, rather than fees, it's the fear of expenses, perhaps indeed particularly the other side's expenses, when the other side is the state, that deters people from making appeals.
Okay, and now moving on to obvious areas, the faculty of advocates are concerned about the period for Revenue Scotland to correct obvious errors and returns being 3 years, which again seems to be a lot longer than at present. I don't know why there is such a big discrepancy, but what would your concern be about that?
It returns to the idea of uncertainty that broadly, as matters stand, after 1 year has expired, taxpayers have certainty that, except in particular circumstances, the return they've submitted and the payment they've made on the basis of it finalise their liability for the particular transaction or the particular year in question. It seems, as you say, quite a large extension to go from a period of 1 year to a period of 3 years. And it's just a concern that that will be a longer period of uncertainty for taxpayers, but also from the point of view of Revenue Scotland. If one starts to devolve, in particular, annual taxes, then one can see that where there is a system of annual returns, it fits much more comfortably with that system, that there is, in effect, a 1 year period for the possibility of random inquiries. There's nothing wrong with Revenue Scotland taking inquiries at random. That's just part of the system. It helps the system work. It's a much better means of organising inquiries than having to take large numbers of them or whatever. But one can see that after 1 year has expired from the filing date for, say, this year's tax returns, there will be another year's worth of tax returns coming in, and there will therefore be this overlap in the period of open inquiries, which might require additional resources from Revenue Scotland if they're able to deal effectively with, in effect, 3 years worth of returns at the same time.
If you can give a specific example of that, I mean, directly relating to the devolved taxes, about kind of a proliferation of returns under the proposed now enacted system for leases for land and buildings transaction tax, there are going to be more returns made. Now, if all of them were to be left open for a period of up to 3 years after they have been made, they would, in fact, that fits. There is a 3 year cycle conceivably on making returns in relation to long-term leases. So one could well see these backing up of uncertainty about your last return, because it hasn't been inquired into, but still might to be by the time you're ready to do your next one. And that, you know, does seem to me to be too long in these circumstances. But that's a direct example of one of the actually devolved taxes.
Okay, finally, the Law Society are not the first to be worried about the Chief Executive not sitting on the board. Would you like to comment on that? And perhaps the Faculty of Advocates may wish to do so as well.
I think our view is just that it's very important that Revenue Scotland works well when it sets off as being the new Scottish Tax Authority. And we think it makes better sense for the Chief Executive to be involved in the board, in the same way as the chief executive of a commercial company would be a member of the board. It would be very unusual for that not to be the case, and we just think that there will be so many technical issues that Revenue Scotland will have to be involved in, and in relation to the administration of taxes, collection of taxes, policy, and so on, that it makes a lot more sense for the chief executive, who has the sort of greatest knowledge about all of these things, to be on the board.
Comment on that, or you agree?
I don't think we really have a comment one way or the other on that particular issue.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John?
Thanks, Convener. We've covered quite a lot of ground. One of the aims of this, and one of the opportunities, I think, as a smaller country, and that's already been referred to by witnesses, is to have a simpler system. And if we were starting from scratch, I just wonder, would we have 4 levels of tribunals or appeals or whatever? It just seems, I know where we are at the moment, and that's obviously a factor because we're adapting what we've got at the moment, but it just seems excessive. And on top of that, the idea of introducing an advisory panel would bring in yet another body, and every time you bring in another body, it seems to me that complicates things, and we get somebody else involved in the mix. So, where are we with this, trying to get simplicity and, okay, safeguards, but... And the other side, with all these bodies being involved, presumably every time you bring a body in, that increases the uncertainty, and you've all been arguing for more certainty. So do the two, is there not a tension in there?
I think there are two separate things. In terms of the number of appeal tribunals in a small jurisdiction, I would entirely accept that, and it actually fits with the point we're making about an appeal from perhaps 2 or 3 experts to 1 less expert, because we didn't do too badly, it seemed to me, in tax appeals before 2010, where the system was tribunal to the inner house of the Court of Session to, if necessary, the Supreme Court. And that, to me, would seem a more sensible appeal structure than simply replicating the current, but only recently current for Scotland, UK system. The argument on another body for the general anti-avoidance rule, I think, is rather different, because it's not exercising a judicial function. In terms of increasing the certainty, that depends on such a body publishing its results and what it has got to in advising what would be. And as that body of knowledge builds up, then it is, one would expect that to become more certain as it goes on. But the real fundamental difference is that it's a body that is separate from Revenue Scotland. Revenue Scotland's job will include enforcing the tax law as it is enacted. Indeed, initially, I believe there was talk of it, producing as much tax as possible, which should not be the function of it. It's to produce the correct amount of tax. However, correct and the largest amount possible might, in the eyes of the state, be the same thing.
Except in the eyes of the public wants the maximum tax.
I wouldn't say that. I certainly wouldn't accept that as far as individual taxpayers are concerned. The public wants the correct amount of tax, and as your convener said, the fair amount of tax, which is not the same thing as the largest amount of tax.
But the public who want hospitals and schools and things, surely they want the maximum amount of tax.
Well, then, no, again, I don't think I accept that the public do. The public want the correct amount of tax to fund things that the public want. Now, there is I think it'd be reasonable to say there's sometimes a gap in the perception of the amount of tax needed to fund the things that you're talking about. It doesn't equate to the largest amount of tax, it should equate to the correct amount of tax.
Okay. Do the advocates have comment?
Just to add to that, and we have to remember, members of the public are also taxpayers.
Yes.
So that it must be absolutely right that the aim of any taxing system is to ensure that tax which should be collected is collected, but that the taxing authority is not collecting more than should be collected. It may be that ultimately, we're not at any disagreement on that, but it is perhaps being clear that ordinary members of the public pay taxes too, and that ultimately the aim must be to collect the right amount of tax. And there's then, I think you've raised 2 separate issues, which are, as Alan said, one is the structure of the tribunals. And our comment on that, I suppose, comes against the background of already having within the UK structure, and now also separately within the more general devolved tribunal structure, a system of first tribunals, an appeal within the tribunal system, and then an appeal to the Inner House, which of course has ultimately the responsibility to ensure that the law in Scotland is being applied correctly across the board. I have to say, if one were starting from scratch, one might have sympathy. I would certainly have sympathy with what Alan said, and I think the thrust of the question, that in a small jurisdiction, where the volume of cases is going to be relatively small compared with within the UK system, one might ask whether one really needs that intermediate tier, or whether it's not enough to have a first-tier tribunal, a specialist tribunal that does the specialist work, subject to supervision by the Inner House, which will make sure the law is applied. There's then the separate question, which is the question about how one achieves a suitable measure of certainty around the operation of the GAR, and I really support what Alan said on that. That what one's trying to build into a system where where by the nature of a GAR there will be uncertainty about how it's going to be applied. Ways in which, first of all, the taxpayer can obtain some clarity, if possible in advance, about how the taxing authority is going to apply it, and also a measure of, as it were, independent input into the decisions that the taxing authority makes. And just looking at the definition of the GAR on the face of the bill, that the panel will appreciate that a tax avoidance arrangement is defined as artificial if one of two conditions is met. Now, the second of those is that the arrangement lacks commercial substance, which implies that under the first condition, you may have an arrangement which has commercial substance, but which nevertheless is going to be treated as artificial. And the only test that is being applied is, ultimately, is that arrangement a reasonable course of action in relation to tax provisions in question. And there's then a very short list of circumstances which are to be taken into account, but they may or may not be taken into account. The only test is it a reasonable course of action in relation to tax provisions in question? And by implication, this could be an arrangement which has commercial substance. So I think there may be a real question in the context of a provision of that sort, of trying to build in ways of making sure that taxpayers are on the one hand given, able to have mechanisms for achieving a reasonable measure of clarity about how it will be applied, and secondly, some, as it were, independent input into Revenue Scotland's thinking about how it's to be applied, bearing in mind, ultimately, as Alan said, that the aim is to get the right amount of tax and not an excessive amount of tax, and also...
Little for that matter.
Or indeed too little.
I mean, would you accept that certainty and clarity are good for a good taxpayer, but are bad for a bad taxpayer? Because actually for the bad taxpayers, the people that don't want to pay tax fairly, we want uncertainty because we want them to be scared.
I don't think we want uncertainty. No. We want certainty of what the tax is meant to collect. And that requires that you're never going to get that perfect in primary legislation. You are not. It is this is where this line is a fuzzy one. One man or woman's sensible tax planning is another person's abusive avoidance, to combine the two systems. That is always going to be the case. Now, the certainty needs to come with the state's attitude to what falls on the wrong side of the line. And that can only be done by examples and the like. You're never going to get absolute clarity out of the legislation itself, because some people will try to interpret that to minimise the amount that they are going to pay while still falling on the right side of, as they see it, that fairness line. It's all very well to talk of fairness, but you said that the citizen might want the maximum amount of tax collected. Well, some citizens will undoubtedly want the minimum of taxes collected on the basis that they are better placed than the state to decide what to do with their money.
Yes, individuals who are not paying the tax. But I mean, would you accept that if we went out to society at the moment, they feel the balance is wrong? And they feel the balance is far too much in favour, especially of large taxpayers who are not paying tax that everybody thinks they should be. And the public would say we want a swing back towards a bit more clout for the principles of the legislation as against the letter.
I would absolutely accept that, and particularly the principles as against the letter. But as I say, that it is the moving of a fuzzy line rather than the establishment of an absolutely clear line. And it will always be a fuzzy line with the best will in the world.
But I think in relation to some of the SDLT avoidance schemes that were being undertaken in the sort of mass marketed schemes, the government perhaps wasn't firm enough in saying, you know, we really believe this doesn't work. We're absolutely certain that this doesn't work. Because often taxpayers are being advised by scheme promoters to do something, and they don't know whether it's the wrong side of the line. You know, an ordinary taxpayer might not know that. But if there's very clear guidance from the state that this is not acceptable, this shouldn't be done, then taxpayers are less likely to undertake it. So there's that side of it as well. That if there's clear guidance about what's where the line is and what's on the wrong side of it, that can give certainty without stopping the state from pursuing people that are actually trying to avoid tax.
Thanks. Just one other point then. In the Law Society's evidence, under your general comments, paragraph 3, it talks about striking the balance between the existing devolved taxes and what taxes might come in due course. And, I mean, you say we would urge strongly that priority is given to creating an effective system for the taxes already devolved. I mean, do you feel the bill has achieved that then, or...?
Yes, I do, but it does still attempt to be comprehensive. I mean, in a sense, we're past that stage. The bill attempts to be comprehensive. You should be able to slot in any number of both devolved or indeed invented taxes into this structure without too much trouble. I think that the way forward, the immediate way forward, again, given pressures in legislative and administrative time, is always to consider from 1st April 2015, how is this going to work with land and buildings transaction tax and with Scottish landfill tax, rather than thinking, how might it work in 5 or 10 years' time or 3 or 4 years' time with the full panoply of income tax. That should be the thinking behind it. How is this going to work there?
You're not suggesting the present bill should be changed
No,
to fit?
No.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks. Most of my issues have been taken already, but the one that hasn't been covered is penalties, which basically section 148 through to 181 of the bill. Both parties have commented on penalties in their written submissions. I wonder if both groups would just like to, for the sake of the record, put their views on how penalties have been structured so far in the bill. Does there need to be more in primary legislation, or is the balance about right?
Well, I think I would suggest that there should be more in primary legislation, again, for the reason of providing certainty to taxpayers. That's the way it's normally done in current UK legislation, with amounts and rates of penalties set out. In particular in Finance Act 2008, Schedule 36, I think it is, where one finds most direct tax penalties, or Finance Act 1998, Schedule 18 for corporation tax matters. And that obviously allows changes in particular to be subject to full parliamentary scrutiny, as opposed to being made by ministers in delegated legislation. So it provides also some degree of stability as well.
And from the Law Society point of view?
I mean, we would echo that. I think possibly amounts need to be firmed up. We have one particular bugbear, which is the automatic collection of small penalties in cases where it turns out, at the end of the day, no tax is actually due. In other words, it's an administrative penalty. We fully acknowledge the need for returns or other administrative compliance in situations where no tax is payable. No system can operate without the tax authority seeing things where there is no tax payable. But it is extremely galling, to say the least, that in situations where a return is made late, for example, but there is no tax payable, there is then a penalty levied on a non-existent tax, in effect, for an administrative error. Now, we've suggested a compromise to that, which such penalties where there is no tax involved, which used to be the case under the UK system, it's only recently not been the case under the UK tax system, should only arise on a second or subsequent offence, as it were, of failing to comply administratively. The part of the reason for this is that we were talking earlier about the relatively cumbersome nature of the appeal system, is that £100 penalty, which is the current UK level for many administrative penalties, is often just paid rather than go through what might be entirely reasonable attempts to get it removed as a matter of principle, because there is, for example, a reasonable excuse for the penalty not to be imposed. And the costs of opposing that kind of penalty exceed the amount of the penalty itself. So that was a particular suggestion that we thought should be taken into account.
And that's particularly important because of the number of returns there are going to be, which Alan has already mentioned, in relation to leases, for example, where there might well be lots of returns that are nil returns. So it is particularly important.
So both groups seem to be agreed that there needs to be more in primary legislation, but the Law Society's specific proposal is that there should be no administrative penalties where no tax is due for a first offence, if I can
if
call
you like,
it that.
on a first offence and that.
Okay,
yes.
but if somebody consistently does that, then you're not
Exactly
saying
so.
they should be exempt.
They have a not dissimilar system in relation to some of the VAT penalties at the moment. That's where penalties only start to kick in for persistent. I mean, interest in the tax kicks in immediately, but for persistent administrative failures, you get, as it were, a yellow card before you get a red card.
Just for absolute clarity, you're saying the penalty should apply on the second offence, if you like, or have you been as explicit as that?
It was just a suggestion there. Again, it will vary in relation to different taxes as to what constitutes, what might be thought to constitute a second offence. In a sense, it is easier with annual taxes if somebody doesn't make a return 1 year and then doesn't do it again the second year. Well, that's very obvious. Land and buildings transaction tax is a transactional tax, so the second offence might not turn up. But in leases, it would. Isabel's example is absolutely right, is that there will be a number of returns relating to leases, and that would be a good method for that to be applied.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Jean.
Just a small point really arising from the discussion about the fact that we would all like everybody to pay their tax properly all the time, and they don't. But I wanted to relate that going back to the legal privilege, or the legal advice having privilege. Is that not then, part of the suspicion that arises that other people? I mean, I think people are not happy to pay tax, but they acknowledge that they must pay tax and are content if they believe that everybody else is also paying tax that they're due. That's the kind of position I see. But I think and from the evidence that we had before, the element of privilege for your profession suggests that actually there is a lack of clarity or some privilege that exists elsewhere that for most people they don't have access to that. And I'm not sure that I was really clear about your defence of your position at the moment.
I think perhaps it's important to keep in mind that legal professional privilege is there for all types of cases. This committee is plainly interested in the specific issue of tax and tax collection, but legal professional privilege is there for every type of case, and it is important. It's constitutionally important in a whole variety of contexts, but perhaps most sharply in the context of ordinary criminal cases. And it perhaps ties in with a discussion that was had earlier, which is that, in fact, most tax advice, or a great deal of tax advice, is not given by lawyers anyway. I think it's perhaps I don't have personally a particular insight into that aspect of it, but it's perhaps a mistake to see the issue of legal professional privilege as somehow giving being a particular issue, a particular problem relating to tax advice, because it's actually there for much bigger constitutional reasons about citizens being able to go to a lawyer, speak to their lawyer candidly, take advice from their lawyer, and organise their affairs or make decisions accordingly. And it's there for reasons that are not to do with tax, not to do with this particular issue that's concerning this committee at all. It's there for much broader concerns.
I understand that, but I think we were only talking about tax advice. We're not talking generally about.
No, and I understand that, but I think the point's this, that it's a privilege that is there for good reason in relation to the relationship that individuals have with their lawyers, and the professional responsibility that lawyers have in dealing with their clients. It's not particularly about tax advice at all, and as we know, a lot of tax advice is given by non-lawyers.
I don't know whether you have anything you want to add to that.
Just to think to reiterate that most tax advice is not involved with tax avoidance and with developing schemes. Most of it is just helping people comply with their obligations to make tax returns and pay tax and all the rest of it. So in most cases, it doesn't actually make any difference whether there's privilege or not. But if there is going to be litigation about a tax issue or something like that, then the legal privilege is important. But I don't think that the main reason there is tax avoidance in the UK is because of the existence of legal professional privilege. That just isn't what causes it at all.
I'm not suggesting that now, except that you've said already that, in fact, the number of cases are small. It's not the mainstay of your profession, giving tax advice. But given that that is the circumstances, why do you think then that the accountancy profession, for example, clearly think that this privilege should be lifted as we write this legislation?
I mean, I think the point is that it is not that it should be lifted, but that it should be extended. That it should be extended to them, frankly. That there is a right not to reveal to the revenue or the courts, indeed, the advice they have given should be extended to them. And in my view, the answer, as James adverted earlier, is in the name. It is a legal privilege, which also involves consideration of where the boundaries of the law are drawn. I mean, the lawyers are subject to the rules, and again, taking it away from this, if somebody comes and tells me that I want to murder my husband, what is the best way of doing it, then that is the kind of consequences of that. My legal professional privilege do not extend to me doing nothing about that particular question if she proceeds to murder her husband. It is a legal question of where the boundaries of privilege are drawn. And that is, in our view, why it should be restricted to lawyers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank members of the committee for the questions that have now concluded. I just want to ask both the Faculty of Advocates and the Law Society of Scotland if there's any further points you wish to make to committee before we end the session. Okay, that's fine.
Very grateful to the opportunity to come and give evidence to the committee.
No, not at all. We appreciate you being here. And
I don't think we get anything to talk about. I mean, having been involved in the tax legislative process quite a bit now, these things are always directed at criticism of them. I think it'd be fair to say that the Law Society, in going through this, there are not huge areas where we found, you know, oh my goodness, we wouldn't be doing this at all, or there are matters of detail that we've tried to deal with in the report. We thought generally that this was a pretty good effort for a pretty significant piece of legislation in a new area for Scotland as a whole. So I think that it is a bill in pretty reasonable shape, with some areas of, you know, disagreement or refinement in it, as you would expect. But I think.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, I'm sure that'll cheer up the Bill team, whose representatives are actually there scribbling away your very positive comments. So thank you very much for giving evidence today. At the start of the meeting, we agreed to take the next 4 items in private. I therefore close the public part of the meeting, and we'll call a recess for 5 or 6 minutes, just to, in order enable members to have a natural break.